I'd first like to thank Datamine for having me here on stage today, inviting me. I'd like to thank my colleagues at Cube who came here to support me and help me to put together this presentation. I apologize in advance, I'm not an English native speaker, so if you don't understand me, well, you can ask me to repeat at the end of the presentation. Thank you. So ordinary kriging has been recognized as the best linear unbiased estimator. And if you take a training course in geostat or in resource estimation, they even tell you that kriging is blue, yes, as in best linear unbiased estimator. But if you look at inverse distance, nearest neighbor, or moving window average, they are all linear unbiased estimator. So what makes kriging so unique? Well, the aim of this presentation is to demonstrate you that kriging, ordinary kriging, is the best estimator. I'm going to make a comparison with inverse distance, nearest neighbor, and moving window average. And my goal here, or my own purpose here, is really to prove you, to convince you to never use, to only use kriging. So if I fail, I can buy you a beer at the free drink after. So I'll first go over the background, the data. I'll do a global and local comparison, move on to the oil and waste allocation and the economic impacts of choose or not choosing ordinary kriging, and then I'll have a couple of conclusions. So the reason we did that study is because despite the fact that ordinary kriging is recognized as the best linear estimator, inverse distance is still widely used in the mining industry. The main reason would be, well, I couldn't get a diagram, so I did an ID square instead. Or I heard, oh, I'm doing a grade control estimate, so I have enough data. They're practically the same, so why bother doing an ordinary kriging estimate? So if you take just a step back and try to redefine what is a best estimator or an ideal estimator, well, first of all, we want that estimate to be globally unbiased. That means that we want to have, on average, the estimation error to be equal to 0. Second thing is we want to have the distribution of the error to be as tight as possible, so the variance of the error to be minimized. And then when we look at a linear estimator, it's simply just a weighted average of the sample that I use for the estimate. So the key thing here is, how do we calculate the weights? If we look at nearest neighbor, that's very straightforward. The weight is equal to 1 for the closest sample and 0 otherwise. If I take a moving window average, the weights are going to be all the same, and 1 divided by the number of samples within the window or the neighborhood. If I look at the inverse distance, I'm going to take the inverse of the distance elevated to a power, usually ID square or ID cubed if you live in Canada. And now if we look at ordinary kriging, well, the weights are calculated through the solve of the kriging equation that takes into consideration the diagram, the distance between the samples, and the distances between the sample and the target, whatever that target is, a point or a block. So the study that I'm going to present is using a set of 100 conditional simulations. So you now all know what are conditional simulations, so thanks, Ian. So conditional simulation that use turning man as a conditioning algorithm. And we're going to use this conditional simulation as a proxy for real data. It means that we're going to use them as dummy sample or fake drill holes, but also at true block grades. And we're going to make a comparison between the 4 most common estimates, so ordinary kriging, ID square, nearest neighbor, and moving window average. And to make that comparison even more complete, we're going to use 2 different types of variable, a continuous variable, which can be similar to a copper porphyry, and a discontinuous variable, which is similar to an Alvin gold deposit. So this is the data set for the continuous and the discontinuous. I can see some people smiling because it's a Walker Lake data set tutorial from Isatelle that we modified a little bit. So continuous data set, you know, it's lower grade, it has a low variance, a lower standard deviation. The discontinuous data set, you can see it's all erratic, very chaotic. It's higher grade and has a higher variance as well. We look at the biography now, the continuous is very low nugget, very long ranges. The discontinuous one has a very high nugget with shorter ranges. Although 100 meters as a range for a gold now vein deposit, I would love to have that. It's more 15 usually. So then we take these two data sets, the continuous and then the discontinuous, and we're going to generate 100 simulation on the 1-by-1 grid. So that's an example of a simulation, the continuous case and the discontinuous case. In this simulation, we're going to sample them at different spacing that are going to simulate or sort of approximate drill spacing ranging from 10 meters by 10 meters to 60 meters by 60 meters. And then we're going to estimate them into appropriate estimation grids, so 5 by 5 to 30 by 30. So at the end, and using all 4 types of estimator. So at the end of the day, on one block, I'm going to have 100 of each type, so 100 nearest neighbor, 100 moving window average, 100 OK, 100 ID square, but also 100 true value, which are the turning bands. So what I did is like you average all the simulated points that fall within the block, and that will give you your true block rate. So if you do a comparison for a realization on the 10 by 10 grid, what we can say here, so what you can see here is nearest neighbor is a bit patchy, a little bit, a bit erratic. Moving window average, it's super smooth. ID square and ordinary Kriging, well, they're very close to one another, and they're very close to the reality or the turning band as well. And that, if we look at the stats now, and we focus on the mean and the variance, where the mean is very similar for all of them. They all reproduce the mean within acceptable limits. The variance, now we can see nearest neighbor has the highest variance. Yes, it's more patchy, it's more erratic. The moving window average has the lowest variance, it's smoother. Ordinary Kriging at inverse distance, first of all, they have the same variance, and it's a tiny bit lower than the turning bands. Now, if we have a look at the discontinuous case, so again, nearest neighbor, it's super erratic, a bit unrealistic, I want to say. Moving window average, the gain a lot smoother. Now, if we compare the ordinary Kriging and the ID square, but the ID square is more variable. You can see you have a greater range of color when we compare it to ordinary Kriging and when we compare it to the reality. And when we look at the stats, nearest neighbor, variance is through the roof. It's very erratic. Moving window average, the variance is extremely low. It's very smooth. And now the ordinary Kriging and the turning band. So ordinary Kriging will have a lower variance than the turning bands and the reality, but inverse distance ID square is going to have a higher variance than the turning bands. But all of them still, they reproduce the mean within acceptable limits. So that difference here for the discontinuous case, that you had the ID square that had a greater variability at local scale. That's one of the reasons that people say, oh, it looks better. Why? Because local variability, greater variability at local scale, it often written with better estimates and better selectivity. But is that selectivity real? But let's have a look now at the grade tonnage curve. So on the left, you've got the continuous case. On the right, you got a discontinuous case. Continuous case, all the curves are pretty much all the same. There's not much difference. Discontinuous case, however, you have one curve that is completely out, that's the nearest neighbor. You have another curve, which is the blue curve, which is smoother, that's the moving window average. But differentiating the ordinary Kriging, the ID square, and the turning band becomes a bit more difficult. And if you look closer, what you're going to see is that the ID square curve is actually closer to the turning bands than the ordinary Kriging. So, is ID squared better for a discontinuous case then? Now let's have a look at this work plots in the northern direction. So continuous case, discontinuous, continuous on the left. Again, all the curves are pretty much all the same. Discontinuous case, you can see that one of them is very spiky. That would be the nearest neighbor, a lot more variability, a bit erratic. And you can see as well, it's really hard, especially if you're sitting at the bottom of the room, but one of them is also a bit more erratic or a bit more variable. That would be the ID square. The other is really hard to differentiate them from here, but not too far from one another. So if I try to summarize all this, the global comparison, I have nearest neighbor that is too erratic, too chaotic. Moving mean to average is too smooth. But ID square and ordinary Kriging, the difference between them is that ID square has greater variability at the local scale. But what we want to make sure is that greater variability at local scale is that a true representation of the reality. So now we're going to go into a local comparison and have a more close look at what's happening at local scale. So if you remember, what do we want from an ideal estimate? We want the estimate to be globally unbiased. I want, on average, the estimation errors to be 0. And I want the dispersion of that errors to be as small as possible. So we can use accuracy and precision, which are usually used in geodesy, to measure the mean of the estimation error and the variance of the estimation error. The accuracy will measure how close you are to the truth, so that's the mean of the estimation error, and the precision measures the ability to reproduce the results. That's the variance of the error. So let's have a look at the statistics between ID square and ordinary Kriging. I've dropped the other two because we said they are a bit unrealistic. And you have here the discontinuous case, continuous case, and the 3 estimation grades that we use. For all of them, in terms of accuracy, we're very close to 0. Yes, they are all globally unbiased. So I'm expecting to have an accuracy of 0, which is good. In terms of precision, however, ID square is systematically a precision that is lower, which means the variance of error that is higher. And the difference between the ordinary Kriging and the ID square will increase when the drill spacing increases and when the continuity of the variable decreases. So that's actually what I'm just written there. So you have more and more and more variability for the ID square when you have less and less and less confidence in your variable, whether it's less sampled or because it's more discontinuous. So what's going to be the impact then at a local scale? So if we have a look at the ore and waste selection, so now when it comes to mining, the grade of the block isn't really relevant, apart from the bonus at the end of the year. But usually when you want to go mining, you want to know whether it's ore or whether it's waste. You know, engineer, they work in a binary system. It either makes money or doesn't make money. So if I try to apply a selection of ore and waste on the ID square and the ordinary Kriging, so the red square are ore and the blue are waste. I hope there is no colorblind people in the room. And then I'm going to have a look at the true grade using this selection. Let's start with the ID square. I've selected my ore and waste. I'm going to look at the true grade. First picture, the true grade that I've selected is ore. What you can see is that I have some blue blocks that I've circled in black. That means we have waste material that is being selected as ore. Vice versa, in the waste selection of material, I have some ore blocks that are being selected as waste. If I have a look at the ordinary Kriging ore and waste selection, and I look at the true grade when I select ore and waste, well, I still have some errors, but a lot less than for the ID square. So what do we want as well from an estimate, besides being globally unbiased and having the variance of the error to be minimized? We also want it to be locally unbiased. And Ian presented that graph a bit earlier today, is what do we want that estimate to be? Well, we want to maximize the ore that is sent to the plant and the waste that is sent to the waste dump, and we want to minimize the waste that is going to the ore and the ore that is going to the waste. So how are we going to do that? Well, to make sure we maximize the ore to the plant, the waste to the dump, and then reduce the other two, we need that ellipse to be tilted. That means we need to have a slope of regression of as close as possible to 1. And we want that ellipse to be as tight as skinny as possible, which means a correlation to be as high as possible and as close as possible to 1. So if you look at the scatter plot between the turning bands and the ID square, and the turning band and the orgy Kriging in the continuous case, where we can see they both have a slope of regression of 1, that's good. But the ID square has a lot more dispersion. The correlation is lower. Yes, they're pretty high, it's 0.947 and 0.981. It's still lower than for the OG Kriging. But look at the discontinuous case now, it's a bit scary. The slope of regression is definitely not 1 for the ID square. And the dispersion of that scatter plot is like much higher. I can't even say that's an ellipse, that's a big block for me. And if we look at the origin Kriging, yes, the dispersion is increased, the correlation is less than 1, but the slope is still 1, the correlation is still higher. So in both cases, even the continuous case, ID square has more dispersion, the correlation coefficient is lower than 1. And for the discontinuous case, the slope regression is not even 1. So what's going to be the impact of this when I'm going to go on the ground and select the ore and waste, and what's going to be the economic impact as well? A way to look at it is to plot the estimation error, so that's the true grade minus the estimated grade, by grade bins. Because I want to see if the estimation errors is bigger on low grade or on higher grade. And I'm going to do it for both the ID square and the origin Kriging. It's not an easy graph to look at, but 2 things you can see. First of all, the mean of the bottom whisker plots for both the ID square and the origin Kriging is very similar. The other thing is the variance of the ID square for each of these grade bins is much higher. That means I have more variability, not just locally, spatially, but also between grade bins. So if I come back now on my local selection of the ore and waste, what it means is this greater variability that the ID square has on a local scale, yes, it looks better, but it just means I have more variability. It means that the grade are going to be more wrong, that I'm going to have more ore and waste misallocation, and then more errors within my mining selection of ore and waste. And the reason for that is, yes, they're both globally unbiased, but only origin Kriging is conditionally or locally unbiased. So what does it mean? It means that if we fix the estimated grade and we look at the true grade on average, it's going to be equal to the true grade. So how is that possible? Because we minimize the variance of the error. And how do we make that happen? But because origin Kriging is working in a probabilistic framework and is using diagram for the estimation. So thanks to that, we can respect the additivity between the variances. Now, the additivity of the variances is very important because it tells you that when you have a point variance, which is the highest possible variance, and you're going to have the block variance, the piece that is missing in the middle is the variability that is absorbed inside the block. The more discontinuous the variable, the more variability absorbed inside the block, the greater the reduction of variance. So the greater we minimize, that way we can minimize the variance of the error. So what's going to be the economic impact of all this? So again, very similar to Ian. He's not here. We're going to apply some costs, gold prices, the cost of mining ore, mining waste, bench height, density, etc. And then we're going to have a look at how much these allocation errors cost in both cases. So that's for the continuous case. If I have 2 drill spacing, so that's the estimation drill spacing. That means it's a 20 by 20 drill spacing and a 40 by 40 drill spacing. Now, the loss of profit by using ID square instead of origin Kriging is between $4 and $5 million. And that's for 1.5 million tons estimate. in the discontinuous case, is between $65 and $93 million. Just making sure you understand the numbers. A pause. So to conclude on all of that, ID square, nearest neighbor, moving range average, origin Kriging, they're all globally unbiased, but that's not enough for an estimate. Nearest neighbor is way too erratic, very chaotic. Moving range average is very, very smooth. And ID square, yes, it looks better because it has better variability, but it doesn't mean that the estimate is better. And in fact, when you're using ID square in a discontinuous case, that's the worst possible scenario. So when people tell you, I couldn't get a diagram, so I did an ID square, that's the worst. No, don't do that. Don't do that. Make up a diagram if you have to, but use ordinary Kriging because you need to have the proper reduction of variance. Otherwise, your OM selection is going to be wrong. You're going to have some wrong mining assumption. You're going to lose money, and it's just not worth it. So, have I convinced you? Thank you very much. You can ask a question if you want, but you don't have to. Yes.
So, by assumption that we can use ID squared for continuous episode.
Can we use ID squared for a continuous or such as core deposit? So as we see, yes, there are less differences between the ID squared and the origin Kriging in a continuous case. But if you take the example of a core deposit, it's not so much the percentage difference between both, but it's a percentage difference applied on millions and millions and millions of tons. So at the end of the day, it's the scale of the deposit that will make up for the loss of profit. So even in a very, very continuous case, that is very large, like a core deposit, you're still better using an origin Kriging. And even I know that on some people on the East Coast, they do Kriging with an external drift. So that's like a non-linear estimation technique. So. Yeah.
If you make up a variogram, what would you use as your assumption? Would you just make a really high nugget and short range? Because we definitely get surveys that you cannot get.
Oh, it's every day you have to make up a diagram. The idea is the diagram is a mathematical tool to represent your geology, your knowledge about the mineralisation. So go back to that. What is your mineralisation system? Say you're working in a Neighbour gold deposit. Do you have continuity between your drill hole? Yes or no? Yes, I will give you some sort of a range as well. You don't want to get too far in defining a range, that's fine. Have a non-directional and a reference phase. So it's key this diagram. Now the minor, the minor direction. Well, what's the thickness of your vein? That gives you as well an idea. In terms of the nugget, try to take another deposit and you know how that will have a similar nugget. Look on the Google it. Don't Google first. Go out there. Try to see something approximate. Don't put an 80% nugget, but don't put a 1% or 10% nugget either. Try something between 30, 40, 50%. Just have a look at what you have. If you have a bigger domain that has more data that you can have a diagram on, try to look something similar. Don't use the same diagram because the variance of each data set needs to be, it's different. So diagram they apply, it's like if you're using supervisor, you have to copy and paste it to account for the true variance of the data set. Yes.
What do you think some maybe North American companies persist with investor methods even in this modern day?
Well, that's exactly how you said. It's North American people. So, I'm actually not sure quite why. I know they have. Their geostatistics is also very different. I am French. I've learned geostat in French, but there is a whole world of geostat on the other side of the ocean. That is in Canada. I was born in Canada. They use ASGS. We use 10 events. So I can't really explain why. I think, well, I hope most of the clients that I've worked in Canada, they use it as a check estimate. So check estimate is fine, you can use it. But apart from that, I wouldn't be able to tell you why. I hope you're not from Canada, I'll be in trouble. Thank you very much.